Have you ever gazed at the night sky, a velvet canvas strewn with the diamond dust of distant stars, and felt a profound sense of your own fleeting existence? We measure our lives in hurried breaths, in seasons that pass like the turning of a page. 100 years is a monument to a life well lived. But what if I told you there was a time when a century was but a chapter, not a life story? A time when men walked the earth not for decades but for nearly a millennium. This is not a myth whispered by firelight or a legend born of a poet's dream. It is a question that echoes from the very first pages of the sacred chronicles, a mystery that challenges our understanding of life itself. How did Adam, the first man, draw breath for 930 years? How did his descendants Seth, Enos, and the patriarch Methuselah witness the turning of over 900 seasons, their bodies defying the decay that so relentlessly claims our own? To dismiss these accounts as mere symbolism or ancient hyperboles, to miss the key to a world that has long since vanished, a world operating under a different set of rules, under a sky you would not recognize. To understand their longevity, we must first unlearn our own reality. We must journey back, beyond the noise of our modern age, beyond the scars of history, to the dawn of creation. Imagine a world not yet wounded by time, a world bathed in a light that was softer, warmer, a perpetual golden hour that nourished all it touched. The air itself felt different. It was not merely oxygen, but a vibrant, life-giving essence, a gentle current carrying the very energy of its creator. In this primordial sanctuary, the earth did not groan under the weight of its own cycles. It sang a harmonious, unending melody. The rivers did not just flow, they hummed with a soft inner luminescence, and the great forests were not silent, but whispered with a wisdom as old as the ground from which they sprang. In this world, life was the norm, and decay an alien concept. The very soil was saturated with vitality. A seed dropped upon the ground would not struggle against the elements, but would be eagerly embraced, erupting into life with a vigor we can now only dream of. And into this perfect cradle of existence, the first man was placed. Think of Adam, not as a distant figure in a book, but as a living, breathing being. Picture him in his 300th year. His hair, thick and dark, shows no hint of grey. His eyes, clear and sharp, hold the accumulated wisdom of 3 centuries, yet they sparkle with a youthful curiosity that has never faded. His body is not a machine beginning to wear down, but a perfectly tuned instrument. He can run from sunrise to sunset without the ache of exhaustion settling into his bones. His memory is a flawless library, holding the name of every creature he has encountered, the melody of every bird's song, the unique fragrance of every flower that bloomed in the Garden of Eden. For Adam, time was not a thief, stealing moments and memories. It was a gentle river, carrying him forward, deepening his understanding, expanding his soul. This was the reality for the first generations. The scriptures present their lives not as fables, but as a careful, intentional record of divine genealogy. When the text says Adam lived 930 years, and his son Seth lived 912, and Enos lived 905, it's not just listing statistics, it's weaving a golden thread through the tapestry of human history. Each name, each number, is a stitch in a grand divine design. This chain of long-lived men, stretching from the garden to the eve of the great flood, is a message encrypted in the very fabric of time. It tells us that for God, time is not an abstract number, but an expression of His grace, a measure of life bestowed, a promise in motion. In this early age, longevity was not an anomaly. It was the direct reflection of a world still cradled in the uncorrupted fullness of its Creator's presence. The slow poison of sin had been introduced, yes, but its effects were like a single drop of ink in a vast ocean. The world's original programming, its blueprint for sustained, vibrant life, was still overwhelmingly dominant. The spiritual atmosphere was dense with the divine. There were no formal religions, no complex rituals, for they were not needed. Men could feel the presence of the eternal in the cool of the evening breeze. They could hear His voice not as a distant echo, but as a clear, resonant call in their hearts. Yet a shadow was lengthening. Even within these epic lifespans, the seeds of corruption were taking root. The long years were a gift, a testament to God's patient mercy, an extended opportunity for humanity to turn back to the source of its life. The patriarchs' long lives were a silent, living countdown. The most famous of these is Methuselah, whose name carries a chilling prophetic weight. When he dies, judgment shall be sent. For 969 years, his every breath was a stay of execution for the world, a living testament to divine patience. His life was a slow-burning fuse, and with each passing century, the world spiraled deeper into darkness, oblivious to the fact that the very life of its oldest man was the only thing holding back the coming storm. Understanding their age, therefore, is not a scientific puzzle to be solved with modern tools. It is a spiritual journey. It is to understand what it meant to live in a world where heaven and earth were not so far apart, where the breath of God was still fresh in the lungs of mankind, and where time itself bowed to the will of the one who created it. It was an age of giants, not just in stature, but in lifespan, an age of millennia, that was soon to come to a devastating end. Before we can comprehend the fall, we must first stand in awe of the height from which humanity fell. Our modern existence is a constant battle against decay. We feel it in the ache of our joints on a cold morning, see it in the lines that map the journeys on our faces, and fight it with every medicine and remedy we can devise. Our bodies are marvels, yet they are fragile, born with built-in obsolescence. We are, from our first breath, walking toward our last. But Adam was not. His existence was not a journey toward an end, but an expansion into eternity. To understand why, we must witness his very creation. It was an act of breathtaking intimacy. The Creator, who had flung galaxies into existence with a word and commanded light to shatter the darkness, now knelt. He did not speak man into being from a distance. With intention, with artistry, with what can only be described as divine love, he gathered the rich virgin soil of the new earth. This was not mere dirt. It was the planet's purest essence, brimming with untapped life. In his hands, this dust was not a lifeless substance, but a sculptor's clay. He formed the intricate architecture of the human body, the strong lattice of bone, the powerful weave of muscle, the delicate branching network of nerves. Every detail was a masterpiece of design, a vessel created not just to exist, but to contain glory. Then came the moment that separated man from all other creation. The Lord drew this perfect sculpted form close and breathed into its nostrils. This was not the simple inflation of lungs. The Hebrew word is neshama, the very breath of God. It was a direct infusion of his own divine, eternal essence. A spark of timelessness was placed within a vessel of time. In that instant, the man's heart thundered its first beat, not a frantic, fragile rhythm like our own, but a deep, powerful, steady drumbeat that was designed to sound for eternity. His eyes opened, and in them was not the confused haze of a newborn, but the clear, sharp light of a soul fully aware, a soul that had been awakened by its maker. Genesis 2-7 states, "The man became a living soul." He became a fusion of the earthly and the divine. This is the foundational secret to his longevity. Adam's body was not like ours. It was a fortress of life. His genetic code was a flawless manuscript, with no typos, no corrupted files, no ancestral trauma encoded in its DNA. His cells replicated with perfect fidelity. Each new cell was an exact, pristine copy of the last, a flawless echo of the original design. The process we call aging, the slow degradation of our telomeres, the accumulation of cellular damage, did not exist for him. His immune system was not a beleaguered army fighting a constant war against invaders and internal rebellion. It was a silent, perfect guardian, a system in complete harmony with the body it protected. He did not know chronic inflammation, autoimmune disorders, or the insidious growth of cancer. His heart, the engine of his body, was not a muscle destined to weaken, but a perpetual source of power, tirelessly pumping blood that was pure, rich, and saturated with life. And the woman, Eve, formed from his own flesh, was a continuation of this same miracle. She was not a lesser copy, but a shared masterpiece, built from the same uncorrupted blueprint, animated by the same divine breath. They were two halves of a perfect whole, designed to live, thrive, and rule together, unmarred by sickness or the shadow of death. Their environment was not just a backdrop, it was an active participant in their preservation. The Garden of Eden was a self-sustaining sanctuary. The air they breathed was filtered by a world without pollution. The food they ate was a direct source of pure energy. The fruits that hung heavy and jeweled from the branches were not merely sustenance, they were packed with life, giving properties that science has yet to rediscover, designed to nourish and fortify their perfect bodies. And at the heart of the garden, a silent, shimmering sentinel stood guard over their immortality. The tree of life. This was not a mere symbol. Genesis 2-9 tells us it was real, placed in the midst of the garden, a tangible provision from God. Its fruit was the key to sustained, unending physical life. As long as Adam and Eve had access to it, their bodies, already perfect, were continually renewed, their connection to eternal life physically anchored. Immortality was not just in their design, it was a gift freely available, a meal to be partaken of. It was an extension of God's own sustaining presence. This communion with their Creator was the ultimate source of their vitality. The scripture says that God would walk in the garden in the cool of the day. This was not a rare formal visit. It was a continuous fellowship. Adam and Eve lived in an atmosphere saturated with the presence of God. Life in its purest form is proximity to the giver of life. Their spiritual energy directly fueled their physical endurance. They were living, breathing conduits of divine power. This is why they lived so long. They were physically perfect, lived in a perfect life-sustaining environment, and were in constant direct communion with the inexhaustible source of all life. It was a triune chord of perfection, a perfect body, a perfect world, and a perfect relationship with God, a chord not easily broken. But in the shade of the life-giving trees, a discordant note began to sound. A whisper, subtle and serpentine, questioned the very foundation of their existence. It did not challenge them with force, but with a simple poisonous idea. It did not attack the body, but the heart. For the blueprint of perfection, the fortress of life, had a single intentional point of vulnerability, the freedom to choose. And a choice was about to be made that would not just echo through the garden, but would fracture the very fabric of time and reality. The fortress of life, designed for eternity, had but one gate left unguarded by divine mandate, the gate of free will. And it was at this gate that the whisper began. It was not a hiss, but a voice like liquid silver, reasonable and smooth, weaving through the perfect harmony of the garden like a discordant thread. It didn't challenge God's power. It questioned his motive. It didn't offer a lie, but a twisted half-truth, the most dangerous poison of all. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? It began. A simple question designed to plant a seed of doubt, to frame the Creator's loving provision as a restrictive limitation. Eve, whose every thought until that moment had been one of perfect trust and communion, found herself hesitating. The voice spoke not of rebellion but of enlightenment. It promised not death, but apotheosis. You will not certainly die, the whisper continued, coiling around her heart. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. It was the ultimate temptation to possess the knowledge of the Creator, to trade innocent communion for sovereign understanding. It was the lure of becoming the master of one's own reality. In that moment, the universe held its breath. Eve looked at the fruit. Before, it was simply one beautiful tree among many. Now it seemed to glow with a secret light. It was a promise of wisdom, of power, of a reality beyond the perfect but simple one she knew. Her hand, which had only ever reached for life, now trembled as it reached for knowledge. The choice was made. The fruit was taken. And as its sweet flesh met her lips, a tremor shook not the ground, but the very foundation of existence. She turned to Adam, her eyes shining with a strange, feverish light. She offered him the fruit. He saw the change in her, the loss of a certain luminous peace, replaced by a sharp, unsettling brilliance. He knew the command. He had heard it from the Creator's own lips. But he looked at his other half, the bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh, and saw that she had crossed a line. He stood on a precipice. To remain in perfect obedience alone, or to step into disobedience with her. In a tragic, misguided act of unity, he chose her. He ate. And then, the fracture. It was not a thunderclap or a rending of the earth. It was a silence. A sudden, profound silence in their souls where the constant, warm hum of God's presence had always been. The connection was not just severed, it was inverted. The divine frequency that had nourished them now became an agonizing static. For the first time, they felt a chilling, internal emptiness. Cold. It was a sensation they had never known, a coldness that had no physical source but emanated from the new void within them. Their eyes were opened, as the serpent had promised. But what they saw was not glory. They saw their own vulnerability. Their nakedness, once a symbol of pure, unashamed innocence, was now a glaring testament to their defenselessness. Shame, a hot, searing emotion, washed over them. It was the psychic pain of a soul that knows it has betrayed its own nature. But the change was not only spiritual, it was physical. Deep within their bodies, in the microscopic sanctuary of their cells, the perfect blueprint was instantly corrupted. A subtle error occurred in the flawless process of replication. A single genetic letter was misplaced. It was the birth of decay. The virus of mortality, once a theoretical impossibility, was now activated in their blood, programmed to slowly, relentlessly dismantle the fortress of life from within. Adam felt the first flicker of an unfamiliar throb behind his eyes, a sudden, sharp intake of breath as his heart, for one terrifying moment, skipped a beat. The steady, eternal drumbeat was now faltering, its rhythm now bound to an inexorable countdown. The world around them fractured with them. The light of the garden, once a gentle caress, now seemed harsh and accusatory, exposing every flaw. The leaves of the trees, which had whispered secrets of life, now seemed to rustle with mocking laughter. The eyes of the animals, once filled with peaceful recognition, now held a glint of fear, of otherness. The lion that had once lain at Adam's feet now watched him with a new, predatory stillness. The earth itself felt the wound of its master's betrayal and let out a silent, sorrowful groan. The air, once tasting of honey and sunlight, now carried the faint, bitter taste of ash. Then they heard it, the sound of God walking in the garden. The sound that had once brought them running in joyful greeting now sent them scrambling for cover, their hearts pounding with a new, terrifying emotion, fear. They hid themselves, a futile attempt to conceal their brokenness from the one who sees all. His voice, once the sweetest melody, now boomed with the weight of their transgression. "Where are you?" It was not a question of location but of condition. "Where have you gone from me?" Their excuses were frail, the first human attempt to shift blame. The man blamed the woman blamed the serpent. But the verdict was inescapable, for it was not merely a punishment, but the natural, unalterable consequence of their choice. To the woman, pain in childbirth, the very process of bringing forth life, would now be marred by suffering. To the man, toil and sweat the ground, once a willing partner, would now be an adversary, yielding its fruit only through struggle. And to them both, the final chilling sentence: "For dust you are, and to dust you will return." The age of timelessness was over. The Creator, in a final act of sorrowful mercy, clothed them in skins, the first sign of death required to cover the shame of sin. Then he led them to the edge of the garden. They took one last, heartbreaking look at the paradise they had lost, their eyes lingering on the shimmering leaves of the tree of life, now forever out of reach. Before them, the world stretched out, wild and unfamiliar. Behind them, at the gate of Eden, a cherubim appeared, a terrifying celestial guardian, its sword of fire turning every way, a living, burning barrier between humanity and the eternity it had forfeited. The gate closed. The age of survival had begun, and Adam, with 930 years still stretching before him, began to understand that his long life was no longer a journey into eternity, but a long, slow walk toward the dust. The gate of Eden did not close with a whisper, but with a sound that tore through the fabric of the world, a final, resonant clang of separation that would echo down through all of human history. For Adam and Eve, that sound was the death knell of the world they knew. They stood on the precipice of a new reality, the soft, forgiving soil of paradise behind them, and a wild, untamed earth stretching before them under a sky that already seemed less vibrant, less personal. The flaming sword of the cherubim was not just a barrier, it was a constant, searing reminder of what they had lost, a burning brand on their memory. The first days outside the garden were a lesson in harshness. They felt the bite of the wind for the first time, a physical force that made them shiver. The sun, once a gentle source of warmth, now beat down with an oppressive heat that forced them to seek shade. They experienced thirst, a raw, demanding ache in their throats that the sweet springs of Eden had never allowed. And hunger was no longer a gentle invitation to partake of abundance, but a gnawing emptiness that drove them to forage for thorny plants and bitter roots. The ground itself, cursed for their sake, resisted them. To cultivate it was a war battle against thorns, thistles, and stubborn soil that stole the sweat from Adam's brow and left his hands raw and bleeding. Yet, amidst this harsh new reality, the echo of Eden still lingered powerfully within them. Though their bodies now carried the seed of death, the original design was so robust, so magnificently engineered, that the process of decay was agonizingly slow. For his first 100 years outside the garden, Adam felt almost no change. His strength remained immense, his mind sharp, but he could feel the subtle shift, the first whisper of mortality. A cut on his hand that would have vanished in Eden now took time to heal, leaving behind a thin, pale scar, a tiny map of his new vulnerability. A memory that was once flawless now occasionally flickered, a name or a place momentarily lost in the fog of his sorrow. They were living paradoxes, beings designed for eternity, now trapped in the slow, grinding machinery of time. Their longevity was no longer a blessing of communion, but a prolonged sentence of remembrance. For 9 centuries, Adam would carry the vivid, painful memory of every perfect moment in the garden. He could still taste the fruit of the tree of life, still feel the cool evening breeze that carried the voice of God, still see the unashamed innocence in Eve's eyes before the fall. His long life was a canvas on which his grief was painted in excruciating detail. It was into this world of memory and loss that their children were born. Cain and Abel were the first of a new kind of human born outside the garden, born into a world of struggle. They never knew the perfect communion their parents had lost, yet the echo of that perfection was passed down to them. Their bodies, though a generation removed from the original blueprint, were still incredibly resilient. The genetic code, though now containing the first scribbled errors of the fall, was still overwhelmingly pure. They grew strong and vital, their lives stretching out over centuries. But something else was passed down, the spiritual fracture. It manifested as a shadow in the human heart, a propensity for pride, for jealousy, for violence. The first drop of human blood shed on the cursed ground was a horrifying escalation. When Cain's hand rose against his brother Abel, it wasn't just fratricide. It was the physical manifestation of the spiritual death that had occurred in the garden. The earth itself cried out, swallowing Abel's innocent blood, and the curse deepened. Cain was driven further out, a wanderer marked by his sin, the alienation from God, now creating alienation between men. Adam and Eve, in their grief, were granted another son, Seth. And in Seth's line, the sacred memory was kept alive. They were the storytellers, the keepers of the oral history of a perfect world lost. Imagine sitting at the feet of Seth as an old man, his face a roadmap of over 800 years, his eyes holding a second-hand light of a paradise he had only heard of from his father. He would speak of the before time, of a garden where man walked with God, of a tree that gave unending life. His children and their children's children would listen, and for them, these were not myths. They were family history, a truth carried in their very blood. This is why men like Enos, Kenan, and Mahalalel lived for over 800 and 900 years. The genetic momentum of Adam's perfect creation was still incredibly powerful. It was like a great stone wheel set in motion by a giant's hand. Even after the hand is withdrawn, the wheel continues to turn for a very long time, its speed decreasing with agonizing slowness. Each generation inherited a slightly more degraded version of the original code. The process of aging, of entropy, was happening, but on a geological timescale compared to our own. Their long lives allowed for a unique accumulation of knowledge. A man could spend a century mastering the art of stonework, another learning the patterns of the stars, and another perfecting the cultivation of new grains. Wisdom was not lost with each generation, but was built upon, passed down from fathers to sons over a span of time that allowed for deep, profound mastery. It was a world of living libraries, where a man's great-great-great-grandfather might still be alive to share the wisdom he had learned 600 years before. But as the centuries rolled on, the spiritual shadow grew longer and darker. The memory of Eden began to fade, replaced by the immediate, urgent demands of a fallen world. The whispers of God became harder to hear over the growing din of human pride and ambition. The long lives, once a testament to God's patient grace, began to be used for other purposes. To accumulate power, to nurse ancient grudges, to perfect new forms of wickedness. The slow physical decay was being outpaced by a rapid moral decay. The lingering echo of Eden was being drowned out by the roar of a world spiraling away from its creator. And the great stone wheel of life, which had turned for so long, was beginning to wobble on its axis, threatening to shatter completely. As the human story unfolded across the vast canvas of the early world, the population swelled. What began with two souls cast out of paradise grew into clans, then tribes, then sprawling settlements that dotted the river valleys and fertile plains. With numbers came complexity, and with complexity, a darkening of the human heart. The world Adam had first stepped into, though wild, was spiritually quiet. The primary struggle was survival. But by the time his descendants reached their fifth, sixth, and seventh generations, a new kind of struggle had emerged. The struggle for the soul of mankind itself. The cities of men, particularly in the line of Cain, became cauldrons of human ingenuity untethered from divine reverence. They forged bronze and iron, not just for tools but for weapons. They crafted musical instruments, filling the air not with hymns of praise to the Creator, but with anthems of their own achievement. They built towers, not to reach for God, but to make a name for themselves, a defiant declaration of their own permanence and power. The long lifespans, which should have cultivated deep wisdom, now allowed for the perfection of vice. Grudges that might have died in a shorter life could now fester for centuries, passed down through generations like a cursed inheritance. Ambition had time to build empires of ego, and depravity had centuries to explore its darkest depths. The memory of Eden was becoming a forgotten tale, a quaint story told by the old men of Seth's line, dismissed by the younger, more pragmatic generations who saw power and pleasure as the only tangible realities. The voice of God, once a clear presence, was now a faint whisper, drowned out by the clamor of the forge, the marketplace, and the boastful songs of men. It was into this world of rising noise and fading light that a man named Enoch was born. He was the seventh generation from Adam, a significant position in the divine narrative. From the beginning, there was something different about him. While others sought to build, to conquer, to accumulate, Enoch sought to listen. He would walk out into the lonely places, away from the smoke and din of the settlements, and turn his face to the sky, straining to hear the whisper that others had forgotten. Genesis tells us something profound and beautifully simple about him. Enoch walked faithfully with God. This was not a passive belief. It was an active, daily, conscious choice. In a world that was sprinting away from its creator, Enoch chose to walk in step with him. His life became a moving sanctuary, a rebellion of quiet communion against an age of loud defiance. For the first 65 years of his life, Enoch observed the world, his heart grieving at the growing shadow. He saw violence celebrated as strength and arrogance mistaken for leadership. He saw the weak exploited by the strong, and the sacred truths of his forefathers twisted into justifications for greed. Then his son Methuselah was born, and it was at this time, the scriptures suggest, that Enoch's walk with God intensified. He received a divine revelation, a glimpse into the heart of God and the coming judgment. He looked at his newborn son and understood the terrifying prophecy woven into his name: when he dies, judgment shall be sent. From that moment on, Enoch was no longer just a quiet walker. He became a prophet, a voice crying out in a wilderness of human pride. He stood in the city squares, his eyes burning with a holy fire, and spoke of a righteous God who saw the corruption of their hearts. He warned them that their towers of pride would crumble, that their songs of self-praise would turn to wails of despair. He spoke of a coming judgment, a cleansing fire that would wash the world of its filth. He was met with scorn, with ridicule, with violent threats. They called him a madman, a relic of a bygone age. "Look around you, old man," a young, powerful chieftain named Zarek might have sneered, gesturing to the city's strong walls and bustling markets. "This is reality. Your sky god is a fantasy we have outgrown. We are the masters of our own fate." They pointed to their own long lives as proof of their success. "If your God is angry, why do we still live for centuries? We are as gods ourselves." But Enoch's message was not one of condemnation alone. It was also one of return. He pleaded with them, his voice thick with a sorrow that was not his own, but a reflection of the Creator's grief. He spoke of the before time, not as a lost legend, but as a relationship that could be restored. He described the sweetness of walking with God, the peace of a soul in alignment with its purpose. He was offering them a lifeline, a path back from the precipice. His own life was his greatest sermon. In an age of excess, he lived with simplicity. In a culture of violence, he was a man of peace. While others spent their centuries building monuments to themselves, Enoch spent his building a relationship with the eternal. His family saw the difference. While other households were torn apart by jealousy and strife, Enoch's home was an oasis of tranquility. His children learned to listen for the divine whisper, to see the world not as a resource to be plundered, but as a sacred trust. For 300 years after Methuselah's birth, Enoch continued this faithful walk, a lonely lighthouse in a gathering storm. His life was a living prophecy, a perfect cycle of 365 years, 1 year for every day in a solar cycle, a symbol of a life brought to perfect completion in God's timing. Then, one day, he was gone. He did not grow old and frail like the others. He did not succumb to sickness or accident. The scripture says he was no more because God took him away. One moment he was walking in the fields, perhaps in conversation with his Creator, and the next he had stepped out of the realm of time and into eternity. He had walked so closely with God that the veil between the worlds simply thinned and dissolved, and he crossed over without tasting death. His disappearance sent shockwaves through the communities. Zarak and the scoffers were silenced, unnerved. There was no body, no explanation. It was a stark, undeniable miracle, a divine exclamation point on Enoch's prophetic life. His story became a whispered legend, a terrifying and hopeful testament that the God he spoke of was real, that he was watching, and that he rewards those who faithfully seek him. Enoch's translation was a preview of the choice that lay before every soul, to be taken by God in life, or to be taken by judgment in death. And all the while his son Methuselah grew, his life a slow, silent ticking clock, counting down to the day the sky would finally break. To understand the sheer physical resilience of the men who lived before the flood, we must look not only at the blueprint of their bodies, but at the world that housed them. The earth that Methuselah and his contemporaries knew was a planet we would barely recognize. It was a world wrapped in a protective embrace, a global greenhouse of unparalleled stability and richness, a system so perfectly balanced that it actively preserved the life within it. The key to this lost world is hinted at in the opening chapter of Genesis. After separating the light from the darkness, God commanded, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And so he made the expanse, separating the waters which were under the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. This layer of waters above, often theorized as a vast, invisible vapor canopy, was the secret to the antediluvian world's climate. It was a celestial blanket of water vapor, suspended high in the atmosphere, enveloping the entire planet. This canopy was a masterful piece of divine engineering. It acted as a global filter, diffusing the harsh rays of the sun, scattering them into a soft, uniform luminescence that bathed the entire world. There were no harsh shadows, no scorching desert sun. The light was gentle, nourishing, and ever-present. This filtering effect also meant that harmful cosmic radiation, which today constantly bombards our planet and contributes to cellular decay and mutation, was largely blocked. The very air was a shield. The canopy also created a stable, worldwide greenhouse effect. The temperature was remarkably uniform, from the poles to the equator. There were no frozen ice caps, no blistering tropics. The entire planet enjoyed a mild subtropical climate. This meant that lush vegetation could grow in places we now consider barren wastelands. Fossil evidence of tropical plants and animals found in Antarctica is a silent testament to this forgotten warmth. The world was a single, sprawling garden, and in this world it never rained. Genesis 2-6 tells us, "A mist used to rise from the earth and water the whole surface of the ground." The planet had a perfect internal hydrological cycle. The ground was perpetually moist, nourished from below by a gentle, consistent mist that rose with the cool of the evening and settled like dew before dawn. There were no violent storms, no flash floods, no devastating droughts. The weather was not an unpredictable force to be feared, but a gentle, reliable servant of the created order. It was in this idyllic environment that men lived out their long centuries. Their bodies, already genetically robust, were not worn down by the constant stress of a hostile environment. They weren't battered by extreme heat or freezing cold. Their skin wasn't aged prematurely by relentless UV radiation. The air they breathed was richer, denser, and likely had a higher oxygen content, further promoting vitality and healing. The very act of living was less taxing on the body. Aging was an incredibly slow, gentle process, a gradual ripening rather than the rapid decay we experience. This was the world of Noah. He was born into the 10th generation from Adam, a man who stood as a bridge between two epochs. His grandfather was Methuselah, the living clock of judgment, and his father was Lamech, a man who looked upon his son and with a prophetic sigh of hope named him Noah, meaning rest or comfort. Lamech, living under the weight of the cursed ground and the growing spiritual darkness, prayed that his son would bring relief from the toil and pain of their existence. Noah grew up in the shadow of two looming realities. The first was the living presence of his ancestors. He would have sat at the feet of Methuselah, who was nearly 700 years old when Noah was born. Through Methuselah, Noah was connected by just 1 degree of separation to Adam himself. He would have heard the stories of Eden not as ancient myths, but as direct, first-hand accounts passed from Adam to Methuselah, and from Methuselah to him. He knew with absolute certainty that humanity had been created for something better, for a relationship with God that was now all but extinguished in the world around him. The second reality was the suffocating wickedness of his own time. The world had become a cesspool of violence and corruption. The scripture paints a chilling picture. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. It was a complete saturation of sin. It wasn't just in their actions, but in their very imaginations. The sacred gift of creativity was being used to devise new forms of cruelty and debauchery. The sons of God, perhaps referring to the righteous line of Seth, or even a class of angelic beings, had intermarried with the daughters of men, producing a hybrid generation. The Nephilim, heroes of old, men of renown whose pride and violence were legendary, further polluting the human race. Noah was a stark anomaly in this world. The Bible describes him as a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Like his great-grandfather Enoch, he chose the lonely path of communion. While the world built monuments to its own depravity, Noah built an altar in his heart. While the songs of the city praised violence and lust, Noah taught his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth the old songs of creation and the sacred stories of the God who walked in the garden. He was a preacher of righteousness, a voice of warning in a world that had gone deaf. For decades he would have stood in the public places, his face etched with a sorrowful urgency, pleading with his generation. He warned them of the coming judgment that his grandfather Methuselah's life foretold. He pointed to the perfection of the world around them, the stable climate, the abundant life, and reminded them that it was a gift from a creator they had abandoned. He begged them to turn back before it was too late. But his words fell on the ears of a people so drunk on their own power and longevity that they believed themselves invincible. They mocked him. Judgment. Look at us, Noah. We live for 800 years. We have conquered the land. We are the masters here. The sky is calm. The earth is bountiful. Your God is asleep, or he doesn't exist. They saw their long lives and the planet's stability not as evidence of God's mercy, but as proof of his absence. They could not imagine that the very systems that sustained them, the stable earth, the gentle mist, the protective canopy above, were about to be weaponized against them, turned into the instruments of their own destruction. The very waters that veiled the heavens were about to break. The patience of God, though as vast as the cosmos he had created, was not infinite. He is long-suffering, but he is also just. For centuries, he had watched the world he had lovingly crafted devolve into a caricature of his intention. He had seen the beauty twisted into ugliness, the gift of life used for the proliferation of death, and the divine spark within humanity deliberately and universally snuffed out by a flood of wickedness. The world had become a source of profound grief to its creator. The scriptures use startlingly human language to convey this divine sorrow. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. This was not the regret of a flawed creator admitting a mistake. It was the heartbreak of a perfect father watching his children willfully destroy themselves and the beautiful home he had built for them. The planet itself was groaning, corrupted not just by the cursed ground, but by the weight of ceaseless, unrepentant sin. A divine line had been crossed. It was in this moment of cosmic sorrow that a decree was issued from the heavens, a sentence that would reconfigure the world forever. The voice that had once spoken light into being now spoke of a cleansing darkness. The voice that had walked with Adam in the garden now spoke to Noah. not in the gentle cool of the day, but with the gravitas of a coming storm. The decision was twofold. First, a limitation on the very essence of life's extension. The Lord declared, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years." This was more than just a reduction in lifespan. It was a spiritual quarantine. The Spirit of God, which had striven with humanity, patiently pleading and convicting for generations, would now begin to withdraw its sustaining influence. The long years, which had been perverted into an opportunity for greater sin, would be curtailed. This decree would not take full effect immediately, but it marked a fundamental shift in God's interaction with mankind. It was a countdown timer set not just for the flood, but for the future of the human race. The second part of the decree was the judgment itself, a plan so catastrophic, so absolute, that it defied all human imagination. "I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land," the Lord said to Noah, "man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them." The very fabric of creation was to be unmade, washed clean by a deluge of water that would erase the world of the wicked. But in the midst of this terrible judgment, a single ray of light pierced the gloom. The verse that follows is one of the most important in all of Scripture. "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. In a world condemned, one man's faithful walk had found favor." Grace. It was not a reward Noah had earned. He was not sinless. It was a gift bestowed, an unmerited act of divine rescue. And this grace would not just save Noah. It would be the vessel through which all future life would pass. Imagine Noah, now a man of nearly 500 years, standing alone in a field, the weight of this divine revelation settling upon him. The voice of God, a sound he had cherished in his quiet communion, now tasked him with a burden that seemed impossible. He was to build an ark. The instructions were precise, otherworldly, and utterly bizarre by the standards of his time. It was to be a vessel of immense proportions, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. A floating box, a massive rectangular barge, nearly the size of a modern cargo ship. It was to be built of gopher wood, a strong, resinous timberand, sealed inside and out with pitch, a black, waterproof tar. It was to have 3 decks, a series of rooms, and a single window near the top, along with one door in its side. This was not a boat designed to sail, but a vessel designed purely to survive. It had no rudder, no mast, no sail. Its purpose was not to navigate, but to endure, to be a floating sanctuary of life at the mercy of God's hand on the waters. The sheer absurdity of the command must have staggered Noah. He lived in a world that had never known rain. The sky was a constant, predictable entity. The idea of a flood that could cover the entire earth, swallowing mountains and blotting out the sun, was a concept so alien it bordered on madness. And he was to build this colossal structure on dry land, miles from any significant body of water. The logistical challenges were monumental. Felling and milling enough gopher wood to construct such a vessel would take decades of back-breaking labor. Gathering the pitch, a slow, painstaking process of rendering tree resin, would be an enormous undertaking. And all of this was to be done by one man and his 3 sons, Shem, a quiet and steadfast man; Ham, whose heart held a restless curiosity; and Japheth, the strong and expansive one in a world that would watch their every move with derision and contempt. When Noah returned to his family, his face pale with the terror and awe of his commission, and explained God's command, he must have been met with stunned silence. His wife, a woman of quiet, unshakable faith, would have searched his eyes and, seeing the divine fire there, pledged her support. His sons, raised in the tradition of honoring their father and his God, would have accepted the task, though their minds surely reeled at its scale. The very next day the work began. The first axe blow against the trunk of a gopher tree echoed through the valley. It was a sound that marked the beginning of the end. As the family toiled, felling trees, shaping beams, and boiling pitch, the world watched. At first, it was a source of amusement. The local chieftain, Zarak, would ride by with his entourage, laughing. "What is it you are building, old man? A palace for the worms? There is no water for 100 leagues." The mockery was relentless. Children threw stones. Merchants refused to trade with them. They became the village fools, the mad family building a giant wooden box in the middle of a sun-drenched plain. But Noah and his sons did not waver. For years that stretched into decades they labored. Every beam they lifted, every joint they sealed, was an act of defiant faith. They were not just building an ark of wood and pitch, they were building an ark of obedience in a sea of rebellion. Noah continued to preach, his message now imbued with a new, desperate intensity. He was no longer just warning of a theoretical judgment. He was pointing to the physical evidence of his work. "This ark is for the saving of all who will believe," he would cry out. "The sky will break, and the deep will open. Turn to God." But his calls were met only with laughter, their hearts hardened by pride and their long, peaceful lives. They saw a madman. God saw the hope of the world taking shape, one faithful hammer blow at a time. The years bled into one another, turning from a decade to a half-century, then a century. The four men, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were weathered by the sun and hardened by the ceaseless labor. The world around them aged, but it did not repent. Zarek, the mocking chieftain, had grown old and died, succeeded by his equally arrogant son. Generations were born and passed away, and still the ark rose from the plain, a silent, monolithic testament to one family's insane conviction. The laughter had long since faded, replaced by a simmering resentment and a superstitious avoidance. The ark was no longer a joke, it was a disquieting landmark, a monument to a God they refused to acknowledge. Noah himself was now 600 years old. His body, though still possessing the remarkable endurance of his era, felt the weight of his task. But his spirit was undimmed. He had spent 120 years not just building but pleading. His voice, once strong and resonant, was now raspy from a century of unanswered calls to repentance. He had become a fixture of their landscape, the mad prophet of the box, a lonely figure whose warnings were as predictable and ignored as the rising of the sun. Then, one morning, something changed. A hush fell over the valley. It began subtly. The birds, usually a cacophony of song at dawn, were strangely silent. A low, guttural rumble, felt more than heard, seemed to vibrate up from the very bedrock of the earth. From his vantage point on the nearly completed ark, Noah's son Ham was the first to see it. On the horizon, where the plains met the distant mountains, a cloud of dust was rising. It was not the random plume of a traveling caravan. This was a vast, orderly movement. As the dust cloud drew nearer, the shape of the phenomenon became clear, and a wave of disbelief and awe washed over Noah and his family. It was a river of living creatures. From the north came the great bears and the woolly mammoths, their heavy footfalls shaking the ground. From the jungles of the south, pairs of sleek, powerful tigers and spotted leopards moved with a silent, purposeful grace. Great herds of deer, gazelles, and wild oxen marched in ordered lines, and from the sky descended a swirling vortex of bird seagulls, hawks, doves, and sparrows, their wings beating a rhythmic tattoo against the suddenly still air. This was not a stampede. There was no panic, no chaos. An unnatural peace had settled over the animal kingdom. Predator walked peacefully beside prey, their primal instincts suspended by a divine command. They were not wandering, they were being drawn. They moved with a single-minded purpose, their destination the great wooden structure that stood solitary on the plain. The people from the nearby city of Enoch, named in defiance of the prophet who had vanished, poured out of their gates to witness the spectacle. Their mockery was replaced by a stunned, fearful silence. They saw a pair of massive lions, their manes like spun gold, walk calmly up the great ramp of the ark and disappear into its dark maw. They saw wolves, snakes, lizards, and countless creatures they had never seen before, all making their way, two by two, into the vessel. It was a parade of life, organized by an unseen hand, a miracle unfolding before their very eyes. For 7 days the procession continued. Noah and his sons, their hearts pounding with a mixture of terror and vindication, guided the animals into the designated stalls and pens within the ark's 3 cavernous decks. The air inside the vessel became thick with the smell of fur, feathers, and damp earth, a symphony of 1,000 different life forms brought together under one roof. They secured the last of the food and water, their movements now filled with a frantic urgency. The sky, for the first time in anyone's memory, had begun to change. The perpetual, gentle luminescence of the world was dimming. The sky was taking on a strange, bruised, yellowish-purple hue. The air grew heavy, thick, and difficult to breathe. A deep, oppressive stillness settled over the land, a silence that was more terrifying than any noise. The animals were all aboard. The provisions were stored. Noah stood at the top of the ramp. His family gathered behind him and looked out one last time at the world of his birth. He saw the faces of the people, their expressions now a mixture of confusion, dawning fear, and stubborn pride. A few began to edge forward, their taunts now replaced with nervous questions. Zarak's grandson, a man named Malak, strode to the foot of the ramp. "What is this, Noah?" he demanded, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "What sorcery have you done?" "It is not sorcery, Malak," Noah replied, his voice filled with a final, profound sorrow. "It is the mercy and the judgment of the Almighty God you have scorned. The time for words is over. The door is about to close. There is still time. Come, close." For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Malak's face. He looked at the strange, ominous sky, then at the silent, watching crowd. The pride of his lineage, the fear of being seen as a fool, won out. He scoffed, a hollow, unconvincing sound. "We will take our chances with the sky, old man. We will not be prisoners in your wooden cage." Noah's heart broke. He knew this was the final rejection. He turned to his family, their faces pale in the eerie light. "It is time," he said softly. They walked down the ramp and stepped inside the ark. Noah was the last to enter. He stood at the threshold, a lone figure silhouetted against the darkening world. He did not pull the door shut. He couldn't have. It was a massive, multi-ton slab of gopher wood. As the crowd watched, a force, unseen and silent, began to move the great door. With a deep groaning of wood and a final thunderous boom that echoed like the closing of a tomb, the door of the ark was sealed shut, and the source of the force was clear. It was not Noah, not his sons, not any human hand. It was the hand of God himself. He who had opened the way of salvation was now the one who closed it. Inside, Noah and his family were plunged into near darkness, the only light coming from the single window high above. Outside, the silence deepened for a moment longer, and then, from the bruised and heavy sky, the first drop of rain fell. The first drop of rain was an anomaly, a curiosity. It landed in the dust at Malak's feet, a single dark spot that sizzled for a moment and was gone. He looked up at the sickly sky, a smirk playing on his lips. Another drop fell, then another, then a dozen. Within moments, a gentle patter began to fall, something the world had never experienced. The crowd looked on not with fear, but with a strange fascination, holding out their hands to feel the cool, wet sensation. Their laughter returned, thin and nervous. "Is this your great judgment, Noah?" Malak shouted at the silent, sealed ark. "A little shower?" But the shower was not little for long. The gentle patter became a steady drumming, then a roar. The sky, once a source of gentle light, turned on them. The water did not just fall, it cascaded, crashing down in solid, blinding sheets. It was as if a celestial ocean had been upended. The people, their laughter turning to shrieks of confusion, scrambled for the shelter of their homes in the city of Enoch. Inside the ark, the sound was deafening. It was a relentless, thunderous barrage against the pitched roof, a sound like 1,000 war drums beating a rhythm of doom. The animals, sensing the cosmic terror, grew restless, their cries and roars echoing through the vast dark chambers. Noah and his family huddled together, their knuckles white as they gripped whatever they could for support. The only light was the faint, ghostly glow from the high window, which was now streaked with a torrent of water, distorting the outside world into a swirling, chaotic nightmare. Then came the second terror. A deep, groaning shudder ran through the very bones of the earth. It was not the tremor of a localized earthquake. This was the planet itself convulsing in agony. From the valleys and the plains, the ground split open. With a sound like tearing reality, the fountains of the great deep burst forth. Geysers of subterranean water, under immense pressure for millennia, erupted into the sky with unimaginable force. It was hot, churning, muddy water, shot hundreds of feet into the air, carrying with it rocks, steam, and the fury of the planet's core. The world was being assaulted from above and below. The gentle mists that once watered the ground had become raging torrents. The stable earth that had supported them was now their betrayer. The city of Enoch, built as a monument to human pride, was the first to fall. The waters that surged from the newly opened chasms did not rise slowly. They came as a tidal wave of mud and debris, smashing through the city walls as if they were made of sand. The towers built to make a name for men were a mockery, swallowed in an instant. The screams of the people were swallowed by the roar of the apocalypse. Malak and his followers, trapped in their homes, felt the foundations crack and the walls implode under the pressure. Those who managed to scramble to higher ground were met with the relentless, punishing deluge from the sky. There was no escape. Every theory of survival, every arrogant boast of their own strength, was annihilated in moments. They had lived for centuries believing they were masters of their world, only to discover they were fragile trespassers on a planet that was now violently reclaiming itself. Aboard the Ark, the sensation was one of pure chaos. The massive vessel, which had sat immovable for a century, began to rock and sway. Then, with a great sickening lurch, it lifted. It was afloat. They were adrift on the rising tide of God's judgment. For the first few hours, they were tossed about violently as the initial torrents raged, the sounds of the dying world outside a horrifying, muffled chorus of destruction. Shem worked to calm the animals. Ham stared in wide-eyed terror at the swirling darkness visible through the window, and Japheth helped his father secure their provisions, their every action an exercise in faith against overwhelming fear. For 40 days and 40 nights the assault was relentless. The vapor canopy, the great watery veil that had protected the world, collapsed completely. The fountains of the deep continued to spew forth their contents. The water levels rose with terrifying speed. Hills vanished. Valleys became lakes. Mountain ranges became chains of islands, then lone peaks, and then nothing. The water kept rising 15 cubits above the highest mountain until the entire globe was submerged. The sun was blotted out. The moon and stars disappeared. The world was returned to a state of watery chaos, reminiscent of the formless void before creation. There was no land, no horizon, no up or down, only the heaving, grey, lifeless ocean under a perpetually dark and weeping sky. And floating upon this global sea of death was a single vessel of life. The Ark, once a symbol of madness, was now the only solid thing in a liquid world. It was the only place where the breath of life, both human and animal, was preserved. Its inhabitants could see nothing of the world outside, only the grey, watery blur through their single window. They could hear nothing but the endless sloshing of the waves against the hull and the mournful cries of the creatures who shared their confinement. They lived by a rhythm of faith. They rose in the dim light, tended to the animals, ate their rations, and gathered to pray. They prayed for deliverance, for the safety of their fragile sanctuary. But Noah also prayed with a heavy, grieving heart. He prayed for the souls of the world that had been lost. He did not rejoice in their destruction. He had spent 120 years pleading for them, and their final, mocking rejection was a wound in his soul. He understood now more than ever the profound grief of God. The judgment was not an act of divine anger, but of divine necessity, a terrible, cosmic surgery to cut out a cancer that threatened to consume all of creation. And in the dark, swaying belly of their wooden refuge, Noah and his family waited, their lives entirely in the hands of the God who had both unleashed the storm and provided the impossible escape. After 40 days and 40 nights, the violent, dual assault on the world ceased. The fountains of the great deep were stopped, their gaping maws sealed by a divine hand. The torrential downpour from the heavens slowed, then subsided. The apocalyptic roar that had been the soundtrack to the world's end faded into a profound, unnerving silence, broken only by the rhythmic lapping of water against the hull of the Ark. For the 8 souls inside, the end of the storm was not an immediate relief, but the beginning of a new, more challenging phase of their ordeal. The long wait. The Ark was no longer being tossed by a tempest. It was now drifting aimlessly on the surface of a boundless, featureless ocean. Every direction they looked through the high window revealed the same desolate scene, a world of water under a perpetually grey sky. The sun, moon and stars remained hidden, and with them, all sense of time and direction. Their days were measured not by celestial cycles, but by the mundane, repetitive tasks of survival, feeding the animals, cleaning the stalls, rationing their food, and praying. This period of confinement was a crucible that tested their faith in a way the storm had not. The violent terror of the deluge had been replaced by a monotonous, isolating uncertainty. Doubts, like a slow creeping mold, began to grow in the dark corners of their minds. Had God forgotten them? Were they destined to drift forever on this lifeless sea, a floating tomb for the last remnants of life? The initial awe of their miraculous salvation gave way to the grinding reality of their confinement. The smell, the noise, and the sheer claustrophobia of their existence began to wear on them. Noah, however, remained their anchor. His faith, forged over 6 centuries, was not shaken by the silence. He reminded his family daily of God's promise. He who sealed the door will surely remember to open it. He would insist, his voice steady even when their spirits flagged. He led them in prayers of remembrance, recounting the stories of Adam and Enoch, reminding them that they were part of a sacred lineage, a bridge between the world that was and the world that was to come. For 150 days, the waters prevailed upon the earth. The ark drifted, a solitary speck of wood and pitch on a planet-sized ocean. Then, as promised, God remembered Noah. He sent a wind to pass over the earth. It was the first wind of the new world, a drying, life-giving breath that began to push back the waters. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the water levels began to recede. It was a process as gradual as the judgment had been swift. For months, they felt no change, saw no difference. Their hope was a fragile thing, sustained only by the quiet word of their father and the subtle shift in the ark's movement as the global currents began to change. Then, on the 17th day of the 7th month, it happened. A sudden jarring shudder ran through the vessel, followed by a scraping, grinding sound. The gentle, constant rocking they had grown accustomed to for nearly a year ceased. The ark had come to rest. It had landed. They rushed to the window, peering out, their hearts pounding. They could see nothing but the same grey water. The ark had settled upon the submerged peaks of the mountains of Ararat. They were grounded but still imprisoned by the sea. Yet this was a turning point. It was the first physical proof that the waters were indeed receding, that the solid earth still existed beneath the waves. A surge of renewed hope electrified the inhabitants of the ark. Their prayers took on a new fervor. The process was excruciatingly slow. The waters continued to decrease, day by day, inch by inch. Finally, on the first day of the 10th month, they saw it. Poking through the surface of the water, like the dark, weathered bones of a drowned giant, were the tops of the mountains. It was the first sight of land in almost a year. A collective, tearful cry of joy and relief erupted within the ark. The sight of that barren, muddy rock was more beautiful to them than the most vibrant gardens of the old world. It was a promise. It was solid ground. Noah waited another 40 days, a period of patient observation, allowing the new world to stabilize. Then he performed his first act of exploration. He took a raven, a strong, dark bird, and released it through the window. The raven flew back and forth, a black speck against the grey sky, unable to find a place to rest, returning to the ark for shelter. The world was still too wet, too inhospitable. He waited another 7 days, a cycle of divine completion. This time he took a dove. The dove flew out, circled the vast expanse of water, and finding no rest for the sole of her foot, she returned to him, and he put out his hand and took her into the ark. Another 7 days he waited. He sent the dove out again. This time she did not return immediately. As evening fell, she flew back to the ark, and in her beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. The sight of that simple green leaf was a message more powerful than any voice. It was a sign of life. A tree had survived. The ground was not only dry but fertile. The judgment was over, and the earth was beginning to live again. The olive leaf, a symbol of peace and new beginnings, was God's confirmation that their long ordeal was nearing its end. Noah waited one final 7-day period and sent the dove out once more. This time she did not return. She had found a home in the reborn world. The silence that followed her departure was not one of uncertainty, but of peace. It was the silence of a promise fulfilled. The long, dark chapter was over. A new, clean page lay before them, waiting to be written. On the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, he dared to do what he had longed to do for months. With the help of his sons, he removed the covering of the ark. It was not the great door sealed by God, but a section of the roof, a hatch they painstakingly unsealed and pushed aside. For the first time in over a year, raw, unfiltered sunlight flooded the vessel's interior, making them squint and shield their eyes. And with the light came the smell of the new world. It was the scent of clean, rain-washed air, of damp earth, of wet stone, and the faint, green perfume of new life. Peering out, they beheld a world transformed, a landscape both familiar and utterly alien. The mountains of Ararat on which they were perched sloped down into vast muddy valleys where the receding waters still glistened in the sun. The geography had been violently resculpted. Great canyons were carved where rolling hills had once been. The very colors of the world seemed different. The greens were deeper, the browns of the earth richer. But it was the silence that was most profound. There were no sounds of civilization, no distant echo of the forge or the marketplace. The only sound was the sigh of the wind and the distant cry of a soaring bird. It was the sound of a planet scrubbed clean, wiped bare, waiting to begin again. Yet they did not rush out. Noah waited. His faith had been defined by obedience, and he would not move until he received the command. He waited for nearly 2 more months as the earth dried, a final test of his patience. Then the voice of God, which had been silent for so long, spoke to him once more. "Go out from the ark, you and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you, of all flesh, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth, and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." The command was given. With hearts overflowing with gratitude, they opened the great door. A ramp was lowered onto the damp, solid ground, and then began the great exodus. The animals, who had been confined for so long, emerged into the bright sunlight, blinking and hesitant at first. Then, moving with a renewed vigor, they poured out of the ark, a torrent of life released upon a barren world, fanning out across the valleys to fulfill their new mandate, to fill the earth again. As the last creature departed, Noah and his family stepped out onto the soil of the new world. They fell to their knees, pressing their faces to the ground, tears of gratitude streaming down their faces. They had survived. They were the sole heirs of the planet. Noah's first act in this new world was not to build a shelter or to plant a field. It was an act of worship. He gathered stones that had been tumbled and cleansed by the floodwaters, and he built an altar. He then took one of every kind of clean animal and clean bird, those set apart by God's designation, and offered them as a burnt offering. It was an act of profound sacrifice, giving back to God the first fruits of the life that had been preserved. As the smoke from the altar ascended into the pristine sky, the scripture says that the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. It was the scent of a faithful, obedient heart. And in that moment, God made a promise, a covenant not just with Noah, but with the entire future of creation. He promised in his heart that he would never again curse the ground because of man, even though the inclination of man's heart is evil from his youth. He would never again destroy all living creatures as he had done. "Behold," God said, his voice encompassing the new world, "I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you." This would be a new relationship, not based on the stability of the old world's environment, but on the bedrock of a divine promise. And to seal this covenant, to give it a visible, tangible sign, God created something new. He said, "I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth." As he spoke, a light rain began to fall on a nearby valley, and against the dark clouds, a magnificent arc of color appeared, a rainbow. It was the first rainbow the world had ever seen. In the antediluvian world, with its vapor canopy and lack of rain, such a phenomenon would have been impossible. The rainbow was a direct result of the new post-flood atmosphere. It was a beautiful, breathtaking spectacle of light, refracted through water, the very 2 elements that had been used for judgment. God had taken the instruments of destruction and transformed them into a symbol of his mercy. The bow, an ancient symbol of war, was now unstrung and hung in the sky, a weapon set aside, a promise of peace. Noah and his family gazed at the celestial ark, their hearts filled with an awe that surpassed even the terror of the flood. This was the foundation of their new world. Their protection was no longer a physical canopy in the atmosphere, but a spiritual promise woven into the very fabric of nature. Life would be different now. The stable climate was gone, replaced by the rhythm of seasons. While the earth remains, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, shall not cease. The earth was now a place of extremes, and humanity itself had changed. The decree limiting their lifespan to 120 years was now in a world that would enforce it. The loss of the protective canopy meant increased radiation. The altered environment meant new diseases, and God gave them a new provision for this harsher world. They could now eat meat, a recognition that survival would be more challenging. As they stood there, beneath the vibrant arch of the covenant, Noah felt the profound shift. The age of epic longevity was over. The memory of men who lived for nearly 1,000 years now belonged to a world that was drowned and gone. The future would be shorter, harder, a constant struggle against a less forgiving earth. But it would be a world anchored by grace, a world where every rainfall would be followed by a reminder of God's unbreakable promise. The quality of life was no longer to be measured in its quantity of years, but in its faithfulness to the God who had given them a second chance. The long walk towards the dust had been given a new purpose and a new hope. The rainbow faded, but the covenant it symbolized was eternal. Noah and his sons set about the task of repopulating a silent and empty world. They were the new Adams, the progenitors of all future nations. But this was not a second Eden. The world they inherited, though cleansed, was fundamentally broken. The perfect harmony between man and nature was shattered. An instinct of fear was now placed in the animals, a necessary barrier of survival between them and their new human predators. The ground, though no longer cursed with the same intensity, still demanded toil and sweat. And the human heart, though given a second chance, still carried the latent inclination toward evil. The most tangible evidence of this new, broken reality was the steady, inexorable decline of the human lifespan. Noah, a bridge between the two worlds, lived to be 950 years old, a final fading echo of the antediluvian age. But his sons, born before the flood yet living their prime in the new world, did not reach such ages. Shem lived to be 600. His son, Arpachshad, born after the flood, lived to be 438. The next generation, Shelah, lived 433 years. With each passing generation, the numbers tumbled downwards. The reasons were a convergence of the physical and the spiritual. The loss of the protective vapor canopy meant that humanity was now exposed to the full, unfiltered force of cosmic and solar radiation, accelerating the process of cellular decay. The new, unstable climate, with its seasons of heat and cold, put constant stress on the human body. The introduction of meat into the diet, while necessary for survival, may have introduced new biological challenges. And most importantly, the genetic code, which had once been a near-perfect manuscript, was now accumulating errors at a much faster rate. The slow, graceful decline of the old world had become a steep, rapid fall in the new. But beyond the biology, the shorter lifespans were a reflection of God's decree. The days of man being 120 years was not an immediate biological switch, but a new boundary that humanity would gradually but inevitably trend towards. The long ages of patience, where God gave men centuries to repent, were over. The pace of human history was accelerating. Life became more compressed, more urgent. A man now had to achieve in a decade what his ancestors might have taken a century to accomplish. The shortened lives were a constant, physical reminder of the consequences of sin, a built-in sermon on the fragility of life outside of perfect communion with God. Centuries passed. The descendants of Noah spread across the land. Their languages were confused at the Tower of Babel, and they scattered to form the nations of the world. The memory of the flood became a myth, a legend whispered in 100 different tongues. The epic lifespans of the first patriarchs became unbelievable tales. By the time a man named Abram of Ur appeared in the narrative, the world was a different place. When Abram, later renamed Abraham, died at 175, he was considered to have lived a full and venerable old age. A few generations later, Moses would die at 120, the very number spoken by God, his body still vigorous, a special sign of his unique calling, but a fulfillment of the new standard. And so, the great mystery of the long lives finds its answer not in a single cause, but in a complete change of worlds. The men of Genesis lived so long because they were a direct reflection of the world they inhabited, a world of pristine genetics, of perfect environmental protection, and a world still vibrating with the powerful, sustaining echo of its Creator's breath. They did not live long in a fallen world. They lived long because their world had not yet completely fallen. The flood was the Great Reset, the event that irrevocably altered the physical and spiritual operating system of the planet. And as we look back from our modern vantage point, with our fleeting lives of 70 or 80 years, we should not see their longevity as an unbelievable fantasy. Instead, we should see our own brevity as the true anomaly. Our short, fragile lives are the lasting evidence of the fracture, the long-term symptoms of a world disconnected from its original, life-giving source. We are the children of a lesser age, living in the long shadow of the flood. But the story does not end in this shadow. The entire narrative, from the garden to the ark, from the long lives to the short, points forward. The covenant of the rainbow was a promise that God would not destroy the world again with water, but it was also a foreshadowing of a greater covenant to come. The blood of the sacrifice on Noah's altar pointed to a final, perfect sacrifice that could truly cleanse the human heart, not just the earth. The breath of life, the neshama of God that was breathed into Adam and which sustained him for so long, was not lost forever. It was reintroduced into the world in a new, more powerful way. When Jesus, the second Adam, appeared to his disciples after his resurrection, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." It was a deliberate, powerful echo of Genesis. It was a new creation, a promise that the eternal life lost in the garden could be reclaimed, not through a perfect body or a perfect environment, but through faith in the one who had conquered death itself. The promise is no longer for a long life, but for eternal life. The goal is not to return to the 900 years of Methuselah in a fallen world, but to step into the timeless glory of a new heaven and a new earth, where the tree of life once again stands accessible to all who are covered by the grace of Christ. The body, once destined for dust, is now promised a glorious resurrection, a restoration to a form even more perfect than Adam's. And so, the story of the long lives is not just a historical curiosity, it is a mirror, showing us what we were created to be. It is a tale of loss, showing us how far we have fallen. And ultimately, it is a signpost, pointing us to the incredible, unfading promise that what was lost in the first Adam will be more than restored in the last. The breath of God, the source of all true life, is still being offered, and that is a story not measured in years, but in the boundless expanse of eternity.